I'm going to just nip to the gents. So.
A third part is going to be whether or not the business method actually promotes more ethical decision making. I'm aware that this may be of as much interest or more interest than some of the earlier things which I've said. I'll try and judge it by the expressions on your faces and the amount of fidgeting that you've done. I don't know how many of you know the practice of actually sticking your hand up, and that's such a learnt social convention, a very powerful social convention for, without making a big racket, drawing people into common action. And so this is an example, perhaps, of the ways that Quakers have invented things in order to, for want of a better word, engineer social activity so that it's efficient. Okay, so moral decision making. This is a tricky area, perhaps, because what's morality? Okay, it's really very subjective, isn't it? Well, working cognitive science has actually started to think about what kinds of moral models, what are the mental models that we use to think in situations where you've got to make decisions considered to have moral implications. So this isn't just Steven Pinker's ideas, but he synthesizes it particularly well. So in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, what this does is to identify models that we use in order to do reasoning in situations where there's morality. And there are 5 models. Perhaps the first one isn't a model, it's just the absence of such reasoning. But then there's tribal, communal, reasoning, authority ranking, equality matching, and rational legal. And all of these words will be familiar to you, but it's the way that they're synthesized together which I think is new. No moral relation model basically says you're a member of a group, but there are other people, but you don't treat them as people, they're objects. They're animals. You can use terms to denigrate them, and you can do things at worst to killing them or enslaving them because they are not entities that carry any moral value. Okay? Lowest moral model. Okay? Regrettably, we see too much of it. Next moral model is tribal communal, where you have 2 groups. Could be 2 football teams, could be 2 ethnicities even. It could be one religious group versus another religious group. It could be academics and students, right? But you high moral relations amongst those people within your group compared with those outside your group, and decisions are made on that basis. So authority ranking, you could think of as, say, a family where their parents are at the top, children at the bottom, or this is a CEO of a company. Okay, and these are employees down below, and it's rationally organized as a hierarchy because that's a really good way of transmitting information around an organizing structure. Requirement for there to be loyalty going up and some sense of care or protection going down. So if you're a head of an organization, you're expected to look after the health and safety and well-being of your people in your employ. And also, things can go wrong. If you are a dictator, you will use these structures in order to do things which we wouldn't find acceptable. What kinds of things might we find acceptable? Well, equality matching is the next moral model where everybody gets an equal share of everything. Right? So we're starting to focus not on groups but on individuals. And so here there are things like tit-for-tat strategies is what you would use in order to organize behavior, equally dividing really carefully the number of pieces of cake within a family so that no one gets a different amount, or everybody doing the same kind of work gets the same kind of pay. The 4th highest level is rational legal models. It requires abstract thinking, and it's things like having voting systems, monetary systems. Of course, many people think that money is the cause of all evil, but money is really very important because what it does is to allow us my needs to differ from your needs, and then we can have some basis for negotiating to get my needs satisfied against your needs without everything having to be equal. So changing things and measuring things against money, as imperfect as it is more sophisticated than treating everybody as equal. If you can think abstractly, I can imagine that I'm actually one of you. Yeah? And so if I can imagine I'm one of you, and by an accident of birth, actually, I wasn't born in a third world country with hardly any education, as an immediate consequence just of simple rationality is I no longer can think that I am better and different and higher and exceptional compared to somebody else because I can put myself in their shoes where I'm superior just because I'm me, I'm exceptional because I'm me. No, that's not possible, so I need to think in terms of I'm equal to others. One of the things that really sold this to me is that it maps onto different amounts of information. So it's categorical, ordinal, interval, or ratio. So in terms of ordinal, you just have different groups. Yeah? In terms of ratio, you're actually judging things against, in proportion to each other, against some zero quantity. Right? And so for me, as a scientist, this then buys into all the kinds of sophisticated models and reasoning that you can have. And so you can describe these in terms of who are the subjects of the models, and also in kinds of the processes that are going on in order to implement the different models. Right? So this is very powerful because you can, in a particular moral situation, identify which model and what processes are going on, and if you want to object, you then have a rational, objective basis for making moral decisions. I think it's a very powerful argument that no longer do I, as a non-theist, have to wave my hands at, well, there are some, there's some objective criteria for making moral judgments. But cognitive scientists and evolutionary biologists and a whole range of others have basically looked at these processes, and as cultures mature, as people mature, or as societies mature, you have an ordering of these models. And so many countries that we would say are more have better human rights, well, countries that we would want to live in, are higher up on this spectrum. Okay? Children are down here. They're very tribal and communal, perhaps, in some circumstances, or they may not even recognize that their brother or sister is today to be recognized as having the same value as them. Moral behavior then can be characterized as trying to push individuals or societies up this spectrum. Also think about immoral behavior. So if there's a natural ordering here, what might happen is people might want to try and push, say, authority ranking above the others. So as a dictator, you might push authority ranking so that legal rational aspects of are made secondary to, similarly with the communal tribal issues. So one of the things I think is terrible is any country that will, on the basis of an ethnicity, distinguish people within that population. So there's one country recently introduced having the ethnicity put onto passports. And that, of course, led to communal violence because it's easy to precisely determine people's ethnicity, okay? Even though they'd lived together contentedly for decades. A function of a moral model then also is to work in the opposite way, where there may be forces that naturally are pushing these things upwards, right? And so perhaps what we want it to do is to use the higher moral models to stop forces which are trying to promote lower moral models. And we can pop up at a further level and say, well, if you're a dictator or a rogue state, what you might do is actually use the instruments of legal systems or notions of equality. My group is more equal than your group, okay? Or changing laws of the country in order to promote these things over others. These are all models that we recognize, but it's then the system upon which you can build that I think is really powerful for thinking. And what we can do is apply this to exactly the same tools which we had earlier on and ask the question, how do they relate to the moral models which you would say are more advanced versus the more primitive? Do they support the ones which are more advanced or perhaps hinder them? Or do they hinder the ones which are more primitive or perhaps, which you wouldn't want, would actually support the more primitive moral models? Ideally, what we would like is to come up with patterns which look like this, where there's support for the moral models, which are the more positive ones, and moral models which are not support for models which are more primitive. Okay, so this is the basic explanatory scheme which I'm using. Human behavior is really complex, so what I'm going to do is decompose it into, does the method actually support more moral decision making in terms of process, and then also in terms of the decisions that are made or the content that's produced. Let's take a concrete example first. The configuration where everybody is sat equidistant and equally able to attract the attention of the clerk is an example of equality matching. So we've got a thin solid line here. Okay? The clerk is trained to try and allow everybody who wishes to speak rather than excluding one group or another. But of course there's a danger in that the clerk could become an authority figure and be treated as an authority figure. But then again, the role of the clerk as a servant of the meeting and the very clear statement that they're a servant of the meeting might mitigate that. And I would invite you to go through the moral models and apply them in this way and see how does it pan out. If you're thinking about the decisions that are actually made, are they likely to be ones which are related more to the moral models or higher moral models or not? For example, if you're open-minded, we are very mindful, though, that we shouldn't be using that as a special position in which to judge others. And so there's a mitigation of having open-mindedness, which then works against tribalism. Okay? Quakers are very much against authority. And so in the history of Quakers, the doffing of caps and so forth is very much built into the psyche of Quakers. Yeah, but you can make similar kinds of arguments, but with respect to content. Okay? And so the corporate values of Quakerism, but also of many religions, but not all religions, are ones which promote rational legal models, notions of justice, okay? But also notions of equality. Try and summarize this. Okay? By P represents here process, and C stands for whether the content of the decision is one which is likely to be more moral, and green is something which is positive, whereas red is something where there perhaps is a clear argument against this tool supporting this, supporting a good moral model or acting against a poor moral model. There's more of the positives supported by the Quaker business method tools than not. This is just a theoretical analysis, as I said, for somebody who was so attracted to the moral models because the ethical legal ones were very much based on quantitative analysis and balancing, weighing different quantities. This is simply just a categorical analysis, right? And really would need a much more detailed quantitative analysis to more fully support this. Right? Overall summary, what I've done is to interpret the business method in terms of a set of concrete tools which I think that you might be actually able to use in a real business context. I've certainly tried to use them in a university context, and it made it a bit easier to chair the meeting I was chairing yesterday, even though there were some members of faculty who were particularly argumentative. I've used the ideas from cognitive science to try and systematically identify what barriers might happen just because of the way that we are set up as human beings to process information. And the business method tools, to a large extent, I would say, have tried to mitigate those. So this natural exploration over 300 years has, I would say, more than stumbled across, has more or less systematically explored different options and then set some aside and kept others at work. Okay. It's possible, I think, to make moral judgments using the moral models. I'm not saying that it's universal to all possible situations, but it's, I think that it's a very powerful way of thinking and making judgments, which in the past you might just have been left saying it's a matter of subjectivity. And it appears that maybe many of the tools of the Quaker business method promote processes that are themselves treat people better in the process of decision making, process side, but also perhaps might generate decisions that are more moral in the end, not in the least because there are a set of corporate values, a set of values in general, which are aspired to, which, going back to the process in the second part of the talk, are in there and feeding into the process all the time, seeding ideas which might not otherwise have been thought of.